This is Stella from Divine Heretic Astrology. You can find me at divineheretic.org and, of course, on this YouTube channel. Um, Please click the link and subscribe. I hate to be those people, but I want to keep putting out videos. And really, my goal is just to remove gatekeeping from astrology. I've said this before, it's so difficult it takes years to really develop a really good practice. Not to mention, there's a certain amount of intuition that isn't required. But everyone, thousands of years ago, knew their birth chart and they went to astrologers. It was a very common part of everyday life. So I'm trying to kind of bring that back. As J.P. Morgan famously said, millionaires don't use astrology. Billionaires do because they use it. And you'll see so many astrologers talk about current events that are happening and how, like for example, when the Epstein files were released, the asteroid Epstein was right on top, conjunct Saturn and Neptune in Pisces. Delusion, and, all the wishy-washiness from Neptune being revealed by Saturn. Anyways, we're going to talk about asteroids today to look for in your chart. And I have another video about how to look for asteroids in astrodience. Take a look, it's in my videos. And so you can find this asteroid in your own chart and what house it's in. But the asteroid is Hygeia. I swear these Greek names are going to be the death of me. For someone who reads a lot as a kid, I always pronounce words wrong. But obviously, this is where we get the word hygiene from. And it's important to note that hygiene is this concept comes from the aspect of prevention. So we're going to look at where in your chart can you really kind of be proactive to prevent illness, both of a physical nature and of a spiritual malady. But I want to start by talking about contagion because there's some aspects of it that I feel like aren't really discussed a lot. And how do we get sick? So one example I'm going to give here is when your personal toxin cup is full, right? And this is like everyone's had that roommate or, you go to your boyfriend's house and he has the flu and you bring him chicken soup and you don't get sick, right? Why is this? Well, their toxin cup was full. They've obviously, eating crappy fast food and burning the candle at both ends and maybe like, drinking too many beers, right? And so at some point your body's like enough is enough and they're going to release what they need to release. Okay, there's one way of getting sick. Um, Another great example of getting sick is, for example, in the UK, when the Sahara has all these dust storms, the jet stream actually picks up all this dust, all the sand from these sandstorms, and it actually dumps it out over the whole of the UK. And so it's known that the UK has the worst flu season because of this. It's all the particulates in the air. And so, it happens at certain times of the year, and they can actually predict when they're going to have more people in the hospital due to these storms. Look, we all know that women sync up on their periods like at the same time. But there's kind of around the 60s, they started doing all these studies. They're like, hey, we think women sync up on their periods at the same time, something that all women have known for a long time. Look at their cycles, and it turns out, yes, women sync up on their period at the same time. Haha. And they do a few more of these studies, and the same results happen constantly. And then in the 90s, a study comes out of China, and it's really shocking because it's a pretty large study. I can't remember the exact number of participants, but these women living in these dorm rooms do not sync up on their period together. And everyone was like, whoa, how does that work? What they found out was that in these cultures, your roommate it's basically you're not supposed to socialize, with your roommate because they can be your competition. They could steal your homework, they could. It's really seen as a big deal there, higher education, and so these women were not friends. And researchers did a few more studies, and yep, like for example, if you live with someone you absolutely cannot stand, you're not going to sync up on your period with her. So it's really interesting. There's a really great, a whole bunch of studies actually talking about the sense of smell when women are on birth control. They pick mates that have similar genes. So, and we're attracted to this by smell. So when we find these, these mates with, if we're on birth control works because it tricks your body into thinking that it's pregnant. So you're naturally going to be like, okay, I need someone to protect me. I need like, someone who's like, of my family. And so when women go off birth control to have a baby, sometimes they're like, oh, I hate the way my partner smells because suddenly, they're expected to mate with someone that they've picked, thinking that, that these people are family to them. It's pretty well known actually. There's actually I can't remember his name, but there's a pretty famous neurologist who talks about specifically be sure to go off your birth control if you're on it when you decide to have children, and be sure to like make sure because you're gonna there's it's statistically linked actually as well to a higher amount of miscarriages because if we pick mates with similar genes, right, what we want is that diversifying of genes. We want someone who's like really different from us. So this the link between smell and pheromones is really fascinating. There's an ongoing study of strippers in New York. The women make like 25% more money when they ovulate, you know? It's like this descent between, there's so many ways to communicate that we aren't aware of. It's not just simple someone goes and there's a cloud of, germs and someone walks into it and poof, you're sick, right? We really know so little about the human body. But barometric, there's a bunch of great papers actually on barometric pressure and how this mimics the quote flu season. And some researchers are like, is the flu season just the change in barometric pressure? Because it varies across the globe. There's a pretty famous event that happened in Antarctica with researchers in the 70s. Obviously they're in there for weeks. People aren't just strolling in, going in and out. So there's no supplies going in and no supplies coming out. And a few weeks into this Antarctic experiment, and in this case, there was nothing brought in, there was nothing brought out. The researchers weren't wandering around outside because it was like a zillion degrees below. But the only difference was there was a really big shift in pressure overnight in temperature. And yes, all these researchers came down with the cold. There's also, this has been documented quite a few times. There was like I think it's a Spanish freighter during the very start of lockdown of COVID that was, stranded at sea. 3 weeks into it, poof, everyone comes down with some kind of an illness. So very, very strange. Also, malaria. I was just reading a few papers on malaria that quite a few scientists believe that it's not actually necessarily spread by mosquitoes as a disease vector because when you look at the maps for malaria, it's always like on these same borders. And these scientists are like, how do these mosquitoes know like not to go like over this one border? Because mosquitoes have a pretty wide migration like range. I think it's like 150 miles or something like that. And so you notice malaria just stays in these same areas. Well, a lot of researchers have noticed that these areas are also near large bodies of water that happen to be contaminated with uranium and other heavy metals. And the theory is that mosquitoes are immune to these heavy metals because they're living in these bodies of water and reproducing their life cycle so fast that they're immune to it. There's a bee actually in here in the US that there's a ground bee where it buries into the ground. It doesn't actually have a hive and it pollinates this one flower that's extremely toxic to every other bee except for this one bee. But because the bee is born there and the life cycle happens in the base of this plant, the bee is completely immune to the poison. I can't remember the name of the plant. It's poisonous to people as well and animals. So, the idea that basically this mosquito is going to come and, it's basically leaving this toxic element and it basically is injecting this small amount of extremely toxic, heavy metal tainted water into you. And the symptoms of malaria are identical to uranium poisoning. They're exactly the same. There's a great book called Green Pharmacy, And again, I have to put the screenshot up because I can't remember the name. I think I just read too many books, I forget. But they talk a lot about, it's like the history of herbal medicine. It's a fascinating read, but they also she talks about how they were just injecting mercury and all sorts of heavy metals into people during this time. In fact, they were like, oh, you have syphilis, psh, we're injecting some mercury into you. Where some people actually think that syphilis was actually caused by these injections of heavy metals constantly. And of course, it's all linked into astrology because, all the planets, rule over a metal, and, Jupiter rules tin, and obviously Mercury rules mercury, and Venus rules copper, et cetera, et cetera. So when people were practicing medicine in this way, they were linking the planets to these metals. And I'm sure it was this huge discovery at the time where, hey, let's inject this person with mercury and see what happens. Um, but another way of sickness is, for example, let's take the Black Plague and Black Death. So these are two separate events, okay? And the Black Plague is a whole nother matter because there's a lot of evidence of these traveling witch doctors who actually were spreading disease during the time. That's a whole nother uh, YouTube video. However, during the Black Death, which killed more people, the woodcuts and broadsheets, which are the newspapers kind of from the era, they depict mass amounts of people falling sick at the same time. Like everyone's at the marketplace, and suddenly, imagine you're at the farmer's market and you're getting your artisanal like juice or double, I don't know, boba matcha tea or whatever, and all of a sudden everyone drops dead. Well, that's what these kind of woodcuts depict. Uh, and people, of course, comets have been associated with these atmospheric changes for a long time, and we kind of look at that now as like, oh, that's just nonsense. But I have a lot of books on comets and a lot of historical records of it, and I think there's something to it. There's a really great book called The Black Death by this guy, Mike Bailey, who passed away just a couple years ago. And he postulates that basically an atmospheric change was the reason for Black Death because it did affect all these huge, huge groups of people at the same time. And you can see it depicted in art. He also discusses about how he is a dendronologist, which is the study of tree and tree rings. And you can see where certain comets cause these great atmospheric disruptions. You can see where these tree rings are disturbed. And, he's chronicled all these years looking at all these trees from hundreds of years ago. It's fascinating. And, speaking of hygiene and contagion, so let's get to Hygeia. Hygeia. Hygeia? Daughter of Asclepius. I talk about him in my other video about the snake and its role in healing. But obviously he was, he has temples devoted to him. She also, his daughter, she has three other sisters who also are devoted to various, healing modalities. And she has quite a few statues devoted to her as well. I also want to discuss too, when I'm talking about hygiene and, contagion, and your notes with some of the examples, like they're just I'm talking about kind of expanding our aperture with how we look at how we see contagion and how we see people getting sick. And of course, a big factor of this is going to be a spiritual component, even though the scientism of the day is going to tell you that, oh, you get sick because, like I said earlier, someone goes, and then you walk into a cloud of, magical, germs and you inhale them and you become sick. But the spiritual component is very important. And as I kind of go through the houses, the 12 houses where Hygeia is in your chart, we're going to talk about that as well, because from a spiritual perspective, of course, your mind and body are connected. Everyone knows that stress makes physical illness worse. People even say, oh, I was really run down and I got sick. We're aware of this on some level. And to the far extremes of this, there's people like Jerry Marzinski, who's a really famous psychiatrist, who, after 25 years of practice, was basically had to admit he was like, I gotta say, I think that schizophrenia and these illnesses, multiple personality disorders, are spirit possession. He's pretty convincing. He's got a lot of videos, a lot of interviews up. Really fascinating individual. this practice of keeping like a clean spiritual practice as well as taking care of yourself physically. The two are intertwined. So, like I said, go to my video on Astro Dance, find Hygeia on the chart, just go down and select her, and we're going to kind of go down through the houses here. And how can you really implement this asteroid into your personal everyday life? Now, remember, this is about prevention. It's not about the cure. It's not about, the universal illness. Uh, it's not about the healing process. It's about how you can prevent and how you're most prone, basically, where you want to naturally keep this area clean.